12 years. That's how long it took for a team of researchers to collect, sequence, and cross-reference the ancient DNA of every major civilization that ever left a mark on this planet. 12 years of pulling genetic material from teeth and bones buried in soil that hadn't been touched in thousands of years. 12 years of comparing those results against the genomes of 140,000 living individuals across 52 modern populations. And when the final comparison ran, when the software finished mapping every branch, every mutation, every marker, one civilization came back with a result that made the room go quiet. Not because the match was weak, because it shouldn't have existed at all. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology had seen anomalies before. Ancient DNA is full of them. Populations replace each other. Migrations erase bloodlines. Entire genetic signatures vanish from the map over thousands of years, leaving nothing behind but silence in the data. That's normal. That's expected. What you do not expect, what no standard model of human population movement predicts, is a genetic lineage that should have been absorbed, replaced, or simply ended, showing up intact in the modern world, unbroken, continuous, as if the last 10,000 years of upheaval just didn't happen to them. That civilization is the one this video is about. But to understand why that result is so extraordinary, you need to understand what scientists were actually looking for when this study began. The project didn't start as a search for anomalies. It started as an attempt to finally settle one of the oldest arguments in human genetics. How much of who we are today is shaped by the people who came before us, and how much was overwritten by the waves of migration, conquest, and replacement that define every chapter of recorded history. The working assumption, the one held by most researchers going into this, was that genetic continuity would be the exception. That when you mapped ancient DNA against modern populations, you'd see the same pattern over and over again. Original inhabitants largely replaced by incoming populations, with small traces of the original group surviving only at the margins, the edges, the islands, the highlands where invaders didn't bother to go. That had been the finding in Europe. The hunter-gatherers who built the first settlements across the continent, the people who painted caves in what is now southern France and northern Spain, across that vast limestone plateau where rivers carved deep gorges and the light barely reaches the valley floor, those people were almost entirely replaced, first by Anatolian farmers moving north and west, then by steppe pastoralists thundering out of 10,000 kilometers of flat grassland with nowhere to hide, no reason to stop, and nothing between them and the horizon. By the time the Bronze Age ended, the original European genome had been diluted to near invisibility. The same pattern appeared in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, across the chain of islands that stretches like a broken bridge between Asia and Australia. Half-submerged, half-forgotten ancient populations were overprinted again and again by new arrivals who brought farming, language, and enough demographic force to rewrite the genetic landscape within a few generations. Replacement, the data kept saying. Replacement, replacement, replacement. Which is why what they found next was so difficult to explain. The study's focus shifted when researchers began working through the ancient DNA samples tied to the Norse world. Not just Scandinavia, the full geographic reach of Norse-linked populations, from the fjord-carved coastlines of western Norway to the wind-stripped islands of the North Atlantic, from the Russian river routes south to the trading cities of Byzantium. This was not a study of Vikings as a cultural phenomenon. It was a genetic audit of who these people actually were at the biological level across a span of more than 4,000 years. The early results were consistent with everything the team expected. Bronze Age Scandinavians showed the familiar layered signature, Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry at the base, overlaid by Anatolian farmer input. Then a heavy pulse of Pontic steppe ancestry arriving roughly 5,000 years ago. The same formula that reshaped most of Europe. Nothing anomalous. Nothing that would make anyone put down their coffee. Then the team isolated the genetic profiles specifically associated with the warrior class. This required a different kind of archaeology. not just sequencing whoever they could find, but identifying burial sites with enough contextual evidence to link the remains to a specific social role. Weapon burials. Grave goods that marked status and violence as a way of life. Sites where the skeletal trauma, the healed blade wounds, the remodeled fractures, the evidence of lives spent in repeated, intense physical confrontation told the same story as the swords and axes buried alongside them. The individuals the field now associates with the berserker tradition. The berserkers are one of the most misrepresented figures in all of historical memory. Popular culture turned them into a costume, fur-wearing rage machines, wild-eyed and mindless, useful for movies and video games and nothing else. But the historical and archaeological record tells a different story. These were specialist warriors, trained, valued, occupying a specific and recognized role within Norse military and ritual culture. The Old Norse sources describe them as fighters who entered altered states before or during battle, states that made them impervious to pain, extraordinarily dangerous, and, according to accounts that scholars still debate, occasionally something more than human in their capacity for violence. What those accounts were describing and what the DNA was about to reveal are two very different things. But here's where it gets interesting. When the genetic profiles of the warrior burial individuals were isolated and compared against the broader Bronze and Iron Age Scandinavian samples, the team expected to see the same layered European signature. Maybe slightly elevated steppe ancestry, given the steppe culture's association with martial identity and horse-based mobility. A recognizable variation on the same theme. What they did not expect was a divergence. A cluster of individuals, recovered from burial sites in Norway, Sweden, and the northern Danish archipelago, carried a genetic profile that didn't fit cleanly into any of the standard population models for the region. They shared the baseline Scandinavian signature, yes, but layered on top of it, or perhaps running beneath it like a deeper current, was something else. A secondary ancestry component that the software flagged as statistically distinct. Not noise, not contamination. A real signal present across multiple individuals from multiple sites spanning several centuries of burial practice. The team ran the comparison again. Then they ran it against the 140,000 individual modern reference panel, the largest such database assembled for a study of this kind, to ask one simple question: does this ancestry component still exist somewhere in the living world? The answer came back, and it pointed somewhere that no migration model, no existing theory of Norse population history, no standard map of how people moved across northern Europe had ever predicted. The match wasn't in Scandinavia. It wasn't in the British Isles, where Norse raiders had carved out settlements deep enough to leave genetic traces that are still detectable in Yorkshire and the Scottish Islands today. It wasn't in Iceland, which was settled almost entirely by Norse populations in the 9th century and functions, genetically speaking, as a kind of frozen snapshot of the Viking Age gene pool. It wasn't in Normandy, where Norse settlers planted themselves so thoroughly that they eventually renamed the land after themselves. The match was in the Caucasus, specifically in the steep, cloud-wrapped mountain range that forms the natural boundary between Europe and Asia, where the land folds upward so abruptly and so completely that entire ethnic groups survived for thousands of years in valleys that outsiders simply never reach, where the rivers run fast and cold out of glaciers that have existed since before anatomically modern humans first walked out of the Rift Valley floor, where the oldest human bones on Earth were pulled from the mud, where more distinct languages are spoken per square kilometer than almost anywhere else on the planet, because the mountains kept populations separate long enough for language, culture, and genetics to diverge in near total isolation. A region so fragmented, so layered with unresolved human history, that geneticists sometimes call it the world's greatest natural laboratory. And somewhere inside that laboratory, a population was carrying an ancestry signal that matched the warrior burial cluster from Norse Scandinavia. To understand why this finding detonated the way it did, you need to know what the standard model said about the relationship between the Norse world and the Caucasus. The answer is almost nothing. There are historical records of Norse traders and mercenaries moving through the river systems of what is now Russia, The Varangian routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea, funneling amber, furs, and slaves south in exchange for silver and silk from the Islamic world and Byzantium. There is genetic evidence of Norse-linked ancestry in parts of Western Russia and Ukraine that aligns with those historical trade and settlement patterns. That connection was known. That connection was expected. But the Caucasus is not on that route. The Caucasus is a wall. It is the place where the steppe ends and the mountains begin, where the flat mobility that defines steppe culture becomes impossible, where armies historically went around rather than through. The Norse and the Deep Caucasus populations had no known sustained contact, no documented migration, no archaeological layer connecting them across the thousands of kilometers and the radically different terrain that separated their worlds. And yet the DNA said something connected them. Not recently. Not through the Varangian trade routes or any historical era movement. The shared ancestry component was old enough that the researchers' initial estimate placed the divergence point somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, deep in the Bronze Age, before the Norse cultural tradition existed in any recognizable form, before the berserker role had a name, before the longship had been imagined. Whatever linked these two populations had happened in a world that left no written records. This is the point where the study's lead researchers, publishing through a collaboration between the Max Planck Institute and the University of Copenhagen, made a deliberate choice to slow down, because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets ahead of itself. Ancient DNA research has a well-documented problem with overreach. A match appears in the data. It's statistically real. And then someone, a journalist, a documentary narrator, occasionally a researcher who should know better, takes that match and builds a story around it that the data cannot actually support. Migration routes get invented. Cultural connections get implied where none existed. The gap between these populations share an ancestry signal, and therefore X happened, gets crossed without anyone stopping to check whether the bridge is real. The Copenhagen team stopped to check. What they confirmed was this: the shared signal was not the result of recent admixture. It was not an artifact of the reference panel. It was not explainable by known Bronze Age migration patterns in either direction, not Caucasus populations moving north, not Proto-Norse populations moving south. The signal was present in both groups before those groups became, genetically and culturally, what we would recognize as Norse and Caucasian, which meant the connection predated both of them, which meant both populations had inherited this component from somewhere else entirely. That somewhere else is what researchers are now calling a ghost lineage. A ghost lineage is not a metaphor. It is a technical term in ancient DNA research for a population that contributed meaningfully to the genetic makeup of later groups, but that has never been directly sampled. No burial site, no skeletal remains, no ancient DNA pulled from a tooth or a femur. A population that existed, that mattered, that left its mark in the genomes of its descendants, and then disappeared from the archaeological record so completely that we have no direct evidence it was ever there. Ghost lineages are more common than most people realize. The Denisovans, the archaic human group identified from a fragment of fingerbone recovered from a cave punched into a cliff face in the Altai Mountains, cold and dark and for decades completely unremarkable, were effectively a ghost lineage until that fragment was sequenced. Their DNA had already been detected as a signal in the genomes of modern Melanesian and Southeast Asian populations before anyone had a name for the people who left it. The ghost was real before the body was found. The lineage connecting the Norse warrior burial cluster to the Caucasian population map